It was just something you never expected to see at a main hospital.
This was a murder mystery like no other.
Police admit whoever did this could still be working on the wards.
He didn't care who he harmed. He didn't care who did the harming.
Well, I didn't make it to the sink. I fell on the bed. My breathing was terrible.
It's very difficult to explain how a human being can get to that kind of level. Stepping Hill is run by an organisation called Stockport NHS Foundation Trust. It's described as a medium-sized district general hospital. It's got about 800 beds. It employs about 4,500 staff, of whom there are approximately 200 consultants, about 300 trainee doctors, and about 3,500 nurses.
Stepping Hill Hospital is one of the 4 kind of major hospitals in Greater Manchester. I think it services about 500,000 patients every year that will go through the doors there. And a lot of the patients are of the older generation, so you're talking between 75 and 80 years old. And, you know, there's a huge staff base there. There's about, I think, 5,000 people that work at Stepping Hill Hospital as well in terms of the staff base. So huge hospital, very busy, and obviously one of the major hospitals in Greater Manchester.
They will receive strokes, heart attacks, people who have had accidents or emergencies. In fact, anything that might need a blue light ambulance, you could end up being taken to Stepping Hill if you're a local person.
On the 27th of June 2011, 68-year-old Josephine Walsh was due to be discharged from Ward A3 of Stepping Hill Hospital after receiving treatment for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Despite appearing to be alert earlier that morning, when nurses prepared to move her to another ward, they found her slumped unconscious in a chair, suffering from a hypoglycemic attack.
The symptoms of a hypoglycemic attack, in the first instance, they can be quite mild. They can range from just feeling slightly hungry and anxious to then feeling sweaty and shaky and just feeling kind of unwell. People then may notice that their concentration is impaired, they can't think straight, they sometimes find that they're not talking properly, and then ultimately they will start to lose consciousness. Eventually they may even go into a coma, or potentially they could die.
After receiving glucose treatment for 2 apparently random hypoglycemic attacks, Josephine's condition started to improve. The incident was investigated internally, but deemed not to warrant any police involvement.
People get sick in hospital all the time. In fact, that's the reason why they're there. So nothing was thought suspicious when somebody had a hypoglycemic episode who wasn't expected to have it. However, very shortly afterwards, in one evening, 5 people had similar episodes, and then the hospital staff got extremely suspicious.
2 weeks later, on the evening of the 10th of July, 5 male patients on Ward A1 suddenly suffered from similar attacks, causing concern and confusion on the ward. Amongst the patients were 41-year-old Grant Meisel and 67-year-old Philip Jones.
I had just got over cancer and I had a leg complaint, cellulitis. I came home and packed a bag and went into hospital. I went on to Ward A1. It was a few hours before someone saw me. It was quite dark on the ward. I don't know what time they actually changed shifts. I don't know whether it was 9 o'clock, 9:30, or 10 o'clock. But I know they'd just changed the shift, and the bag with antibiotics in of mine was empty. And a nurse came and took it off. And then the other nurse came and said I had blood in me, cannula. And then within 5 seconds, I started getting really hot and sweaty. I got up to wash my face at the sink, which is only a few yards away. But I didn't make it to the sink. I fell on the bed. My breathing was terrible. Another nurse came, the staff nurse I think she was, opening these packets of glucose and telling me to swallow it. But I'm still sweating and they're asking me questions. I knew what questions he was asking me, but I was answering them wrong. Well, it was very scary, really. I didn't know what to think, because I just thought I'd gone into hospital for antibiotics, which are supposed to make you feel better, really, not worse.
Of the 5 patients who were affected that evening on Ward A1, only Philip was diabetic, and the only one who could expect to suffer blood sugar complications, although he controlled his illness by diet rather than insulin injections. Luckily for Philip, the glucose he was administered by the quick-thinking medical staff helped him to recover.
Started coming round then, after 3 hours, so the glucose must have been working by then. My breathing was getting better and, you know, was able to talk.
The same evening that Philip was treated by medical staff, 41-year-old Grant Meisel was admitted to Stepping Hill Hospital to have his breathing monitored. Grant had phoned his sister to say he'd taken an overdose of medication.
It was a dose of prescription medication that he'd taken too much of, and so he was not very well, needed to be monitored, but thankfully he hadn't taken a dose which was life-threatening or indeed which was likely to cause him any long-term damage.
Grant was transferred to Ward A1.
There's nothing in the records that indicate there were any concerns about him overnight, but the following morning, at about the time of the shift change, a healthcare assistant discovered him having what appeared to be a seizure.
When Grant was then examined by the medical staff, it was discovered that his blood sugar levels were life-threateningly low. He was given emergency treatment and rushed to intensive care to be placed on a ventilator.
So that's really when the alarm was raised, particularly when a number of people, as well as Grant Meisel, found themselves in the same situation.
The number that occurred on that single night really raised alarm signals.
On July the 11th, 2011, the evening after a worrying spate of hypoglycemic attacks at Stepping Hill Hospital, suspicions that something untoward was happening were realised when a nurse on Ward A3 noticed that a saline ampoule she was about to administer to a patient appeared foamy rather than clear.
I received a call from the deputy medical director to tell me that they have identified a potential contaminant in a saline ampoule. When they went into the treatment room and they were picking up ampoules, they discovered that some of them were leaking some fluid that appeared to have a fruity smell. And that was clearly a contaminant.
In total, 45 ampoules were found, which had been punctured with a hypodermic syringe, 19 of which had been contaminated. All of these were ready to be administered to patients.
The whole country were concerned about whether or not, for example, is every saline drip in the whole country contaminated? Because was it done at the factory rather than happening at the hospital? So hospitals around the country were looking at their saline supplies to ensure that they hadn't been contaminated.
With this concern, doctors looked carefully at the recent deaths of 3 patients. 71-year-old Arnold Lancaster, 44-year-old mother of 2, Tracy Arden, and 83-year-old Derek Weaver. In total, there were over 20 patients in 3 wards affected over a period of just 4 weeks. Staff at the hospital decided to contact Greater Manchester Police.
Because we couldn't reassure ourselves that there weren't any other contaminated bags anywhere in the hospital, we decided to remove all the stock from everywhere, replace it with new stock, and at the same time ensure that where those stocks were being stored on the wards, that the room will be locked and that any fluids that will be required to be taken from those rooms, there will need to be 2 nurses or 2 members of staff going in together and signing for those fluids.
Greater Manchester Police were very much aware that they were dealing with a criminal matter rather than just simply a health matter. Of course, prosecutors weren't involved at that stage. This was simply about containing the situation, understanding what had happened and trying to prevent further harm occurring. Very quickly, they identified all of the individuals that had saline drips, and so examination of the drips that they had been given found that they had been contaminated with insulin rather than just simply saline liquid. And so then we knew that we were dealing with a criminal matter.
With investigators now certain that the victims had been poisoned with insulin, Greater Manchester Police began the hugely complex task of finding the person responsible.
You had about 700 staff working on any one time. You would have had people coming in and out, including patients, and you had visitors. In a hospital of the size of Stepping Hill, there were a number of places where drips were kept, where medication was kept. All of them pretty much were insecure. It is as busy as a shopping centre, and therefore it's pretty impossible to try and identify any one person that might be responsible for anything criminal.
Although we didn't know at that point in time whether the criminal act was committed by either a member of staff or by a visitor, we didn't know, but you still feel angry that someone decided in his warped mind or had warped mind to do something so cruel and so despicable as this. You have to keep a lid in order to always present a very professional approach and attitude, but nevertheless, I think in retrospect, it was extraordinarily difficult for everyone, not only for me, but for everyone. And whether you were having an executive role or being a nurse or a doctor working in the organisation, you felt the pressure and the stress.
We had a hospital in meltdown with every non-emergency patient being turned away. We had doctors and nurses working in twos because we didn't know who was responsible for what. We had teams going up and down the hospital to try and identify where contamination had taken place.
At that point in time, we were still uncertain in terms of what we were dealing with, whether there was one perpetrator or several perpetrators and where they worked. We had a rather high senior level meeting of NHS Northwest, and it was agreed that because of the stress that staff were under, and also because we felt that we needed to control the situation much better, that medical emergencies would be diverted to neighbouring hospitals.
With this hospital now a crime scene, security around drugs, but also around saline, is strict.
The community was scared, and the hospital authorities were scared, and therefore there was a real sense of we need to get to the bottom of this as fast as possible.
Key 103
News.
We start with some breaking news. Detectives are investigating a number of deaths at Stockport's Stepping Hill Hospital. We first were alerted to the fact that there was something seriously going on at Stepping Hill Hospital when we received a police press release. A number of unexplained deaths and obviously people falling ill, and they were launching this major investigation. There was dozens of police officers. The hospital was on lockdown. The security measures that were put in place in terms of people coming in and coming out. It was just something you'd never expected to see at a main hospital.
A week after they began investigating, police admit whoever did this could still be working on the wards. So your theory is that it's likely to be someone of staff?
I would suggest that they would need an understanding of what they're doing to be able to have carried out the contamination that we've found to date.
The media came in their droves, and therefore there was an even greater sense of urgency to work at some speed. a lot of pressure put on the police to identify the culprit. This led to the sorry situation where they identified Rebecca Layton, who was a nurse at the hospital, as being the perpetrator.
27-year-old Rebecca Layton worked as a staff nurse at Stepping Hill.
Through all the various work that was going on in terms of analysis of ward patterns, staffing patterns, they came to the conclusion that she was at the scene of at least one of the contaminations.
Although Rebecca Layton was not the only member of staff to have been working on the wards at the time of the poisonings, attention turned to her when detectives believed they had identified a possible motive that suggested she was angry at being passed over for promotion. Greater Manchester Police also discovered that Rebecca Layton had been stealing medication from the hospital.
This was a huge, stressful episode for everyone working for the organisation, for the NHS. And we wanted closure. And part of that closure was, have we got someone that has been accused and is going to be prosecuted? But at the same time, we were relieved because we said, well, we can now start to get back to normal.
Media attention soon shifted away from the hospital and focused on the prime suspect, who some newspapers dubbed the Angel of Death.
The media love this kind of thing. I mean, that's just the nature of the media. So they went to town on Rebecca Layton, examining her life, what might have caused her to do this, going through her family and everything else, and going to court and watching everything.
Her picture was plastered all over the media, all over the front pages. And then the headlines came with it of killer nurse, in inverted commas. You know, this girl's been arrested, first of all. You know, she's been spoken to as part of the investigation. She's not been found guilty. It was literally guilty before even being tried. She made her first appearance in court, which was via video link. She was told that she'd be remanded in custody.
On the 20th of July 2011, Rebecca Layton was arrested and charged with 3 counts of causing criminal damage with intent to danger life, along with additional charges including theft of medication.
You can imagine from her point of view, that must have been absolutely terrifying. The fear that must have been going through her mind at that point and being put in a prison with people who have killed must have been, well, it's unimaginable.
With the further analysis that took place, it was evident to me there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute Rebecca Layton, and clearly she hadn't done this. There was evidence certainly in relation to prescribed drugs, but nothing more. And so 6 weeks in or so, as soon as I had all that evidence, I decided to discontinue the case against her and free her from custody, and that was the right thing to do.
The Crown Prosecution Service announced that the case against Rebecca Layton had been discontinued and she was freed from Style Prison. Despite this, she remained suspended by Stockport NHS Foundation Trust and was eventually sacked for stealing medication.
The police were forced to say Rebecca Layton was the wrong person. We got the wrong person, and we will all openly admit that. You know, and her lawyers were saying she was made a scapegoat because a lot of the pressure was focused on the fact that you had somebody on the loose at a hospital. The public, the media, the staff, the police, they all wanted somebody to be held accountable for that.
It is a complex investigation. It will take us time to work through, but like any investigation, this is a search for the truth. And whilst we wish to prosecute those responsible and bring them to justice, we equally have to discount and eliminate people from the inquiry who are not responsible and are dedicated medical professionals.
We went back to square one. And then we knew that we were in for a long struggle, because we knew that in order to find incriminating evidence, it was going to be very, very difficult.
It all kind of went quiet for at least 6 months. I say quiet in a sense of there were no more incidents at the hospital. They made an arrest. Suddenly everything stops at the hospital. There's no more dramas, there's no more incidents. You know, all the fingers are pointing at, you know, this girl who's in custody. And yet when we're told that she's nothing to do with it, then you think, well, who did it? And how did that person feel when suddenly somebody else is taking the flak for what they've done? The security was so tight at the hospital, and with all the extra security checks and measures that have been put in place, it was impossible for whoever was responsible to carry on with this poisoning spree.
Despite the scale of the police inquiry, months on, they were still no closer to identifying the person behind the poisonings, and every member of staff at the hospital remained a suspect.
They had hundreds and hundreds of potential suspects. We'd now isolated it to staff members on the basis of what you needed to be able to know to do what you did. But there were hundreds of staff members. And so we literally had to eliminate so that there was just one left. And that meant going through, the police phenomenally going through every chart known to man to try and identify who was where at what time.
You not only have the core members of nursing staff, which will be probably on average about 50 per ward. There may be up to about 8 doctors working on A1 and on A3, so it's quite a sizable number of staff.
When we're talking about potentially 700 people, including visitors and everybody else, I can't begin to imagine how complicated it was and how urgent it was that this was dealt with.
6 months after the poisonings began, police received news of a possible breakthrough in the investigation.
The person that was carrying out these poisonings and these sinister acts struck again, or so it seemed.
As the police investigation into the apparent poisonings at Stepping Hill Hospital carried on, hospital management continued to strictly monitor staff access to saline and other medicines. But 6 months on from the first suspicious death at the hospital, and with security tightened, it appeared the perpetrator had moved away from poisoning when staff alerted police to medical records they believed had been altered.
I was required to go urgently to A3. I was shown prescription charts, which are charts that we use in order to prescribe medication, and then nurses use to administer the medication. And when we looked at the medication, it was clear that some of the dosages were altered.
The person responsible had understood that no longer was it possible for the contamination of saline drips to be effected, and that would mean that particular avenue of harming people was no longer available. So the perpetrator then chose a different tack, and namely fabricating and adding things to patient records, which would mean that they would receive fatal doses of medication that clearly they didn't deserve to, or didn't receive, or shouldn't receive.
Just to give you an example, a patient was being prescribed prednisolone, 30 milligrams a day, which is a drug that we use to reduce inflammation. But the 30 was converted into an 80. Similarly, another drug that we normally use as treatment for heart attacks, the dose of 1.5 was changed to 7.5. Now, the reason why we felt that these were clearly altered intentionally is because these dosages were either too high or excessive and never used. The reason why that was so critical was because we were able to locate when that happened. So we were able to tie a certain group of staff to that event. And because it occurred during the night, the net was getting narrower and narrower.
Having whittled down the number of staff members who could have tampered with patients' notes, detectives were now able to determine whether any of these suspects could also have been behind the act of poisoning patients' saline bags the previous year.
This was a murder mystery like no other. When you've got so many suspects, 700 staff members who could capably carry out this act, we had to eliminate them one by one. We had tens of thousands of hours of CCTV, and the police, having scoured that, were able to identify who was going where, at what time, and we could see individuals that we could therefore quickly eliminate, because they were certainly nowhere near the individuals that had been given the drips or when the drips had been contaminated. But it then enabled us to focus on one man.
All of a sudden, in January, we're alerted to the fact that somebody has been arrested.
A 46-year-old male nurse has been arrested on suspicion of tampering with medical records.
On the 5th of January 2012, police arrested Filipino nurse Victorino Chua in connection with the unlawful altering of medical records. His home was searched and he was questioned by detectives investigating the poisonings at Stepping Hill Hospital the previous summer.
In order to maintain public confidence, you had to get it right second time. And the police, having identified Chua, had similar amounts of evidence to that which was used to charge Rebecca Layton. I was spending various hours talking to Assistant Chief Constable at the Greater Manchester Police, who was trying to persuade me that they already had enough evidence. And given the complexity of this matter, given the amount of scientific evidence that was going to be necessary, I persuaded him that it was not right to charge Chua at this time. It was too early to charge him. There was so much work to do.
I was watching the television one night, the news at 6:30, and a fella came on his bike, and I recognised him. The police came, and then I said to him, he was on my ward at night, and they said, yeah, he were. So they confirmed that he was on my ward, and I knew that he was the one that had washed my camera out.
Part of the evidence against Chua was tampering with patient charts, where the amount of particular drugs they were due to receive had been tampered in hand by some individual. We had lots of bits of evidence that pointed to Chua being our prime suspect.
Victorino Chua was bailed because he was still a very significant part of the investigation. They just needed to make sure they had enough evidence to put to the Crown Prosecution Service. So the police then have this task on their hands of collating as much evidence as they can against Victorino Chua. And it was a difficult task.
Given the nature of this case, the amount of scientific evidence that needed to be examined, I had to instruct experts after expert to show that, what had happened, how it had been caused. Because one element of the defence would have been, potentially, natural causes. Your body actually does produce sugar. Insulin is produced in your body. So we had to show that what caused the harm was what he had done and not what your natural body does. And it took a long time, but I wanted to make sure that we had all of that ready, so when we were in a position to charge him, it was then quick to trial, and that we could present all our evidence to the court with speed.
After the arrest of Victorino Chua, the media began looking into his background and investigating the Filipino's medical career.
It was a case which was really high profile. A decision was taken that I should go to Manila, initially for a few days, to see, what Mr. Chua's background was. When we arrived in Manila, all we knew was his name and his date of birth. He was supposedly a trained nurse, fully qualified nurse. No reason to believe there's anything sinister about his background. So we made an application to the nursing regulator to find out if he was qualified, and then made some inquiries with the police. Our inquiries revealed that he had studied at the Metropolitan Hospital Nursing College. We discovered that he had been kicked out of the college, I think in the third year. He'd failed miserably and had switched to another nursing college, the Galang, which was one of the least respected nursing institutions in Manila.
Stephen Wright's investigation into Victorino Chua led him to a former college registrar who provided him with Chua's college records.
He invited us in to his home and he found Victorino Chua's college records. He produced them and I became very, very suspicious very quickly. The fact that there seemed to have been marks seemed like someone had changed the results. I was really concerned that this could be open to abuse. These records should not have been held at that place. They should be held centrally by the regulator. Very suspicious indeed, very suspicious.
To many Filipinos, nursing is viewed as a passport out of poverty, and the lure of lucrative work overseas has led to a booming forgery industry. Although the authorities could not categorically state that Chua's documents were forged, police were so concerned about their veracity that they themselves visited Manila. Their investigations uncovered so many loopholes in the system that they eventually raised the issue with the British government. Police now wondered if the ambiguity surrounding Chua's credentials had allowed him to leave the Philippines and secure a job with a much higher income in Britain.
He came to the UK in 2002 to work in a nursing home. He became a bank nurse for the NHS in 2007, got a full-time job at Stepping Hill in 2009. But the crucial thing really was that soon after arriving in the UK, he was approved by the Nursing and Midwifery Council on the basis of showing photocopies of his alleged qualifications.
We employed Victor Chua because he had a license to practice as a nurse from the Nursing and Midwifery Council. I understand that they now have got more robust processes in order to ensure that certificates or professional qualifications, particularly of nurses coming from abroad, are coming from bona fide associations and institutions.
Back in the UK, as the investigation into Victorino Chua continued, detectives uncovered a vital piece of new evidence. A handwritten letter that revealed an insight into the mind of Chua.
It was written by Victorino Chua about himself. He talks about himself and he talks about his life and he talks about his dark thoughts. And there were certain things in that letter that suddenly kind of pieced this all together for police.
He talks about how much he was hated, how much he hated the hospital and the fellow staff that he had there and the patients, how much he felt done by, having come to this country and given his all, and this is how he was being treated. He also called himself the Angel of Death.
They called it the confession letter because he talked about being the Angel of Death and how he wasn't a very nice man, yet people think he was, that there was an evil about him.
In any case of crime of this nature, what you always look for is motivation. What motivated a person? Because you've got to, at the end of the day, you've got to explain to a jury who are 12 men and women who don't know anything about this case before they walk in the court. And they'll be thinking, like we all think, well, why did somebody do this? And so the why was what was missing. And this letter gave us the why.
Victorino Chua was re-arrested on the 28th of March, 2014.
In relation to this perpetrator, we had what we call circumstantial evidence. It is literally like a jigsaw puzzle. Each bit on its own probably doesn't amount to much. It might be a fingerprint there, it might be a CCTV still there, it may well be some writing on a patient record there, it would be ward records that show presence at a particular time. But if you add it all together, you then have a picture that shows you that you have the perpetrator.
With the Crown Prosecution Service satisfied that Greater Manchester Police had gathered sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, Victorino Chua's trial got underway at Manchester Crown Court on the 20th of January 2015.
12 members of the public from Greater Manchester come into a courtroom and they don't know what they're dealing with. An enormous undertaking. And the evidence itself was so complicated. And, I don't know how many people know medical experts, but everything that they say had to be, in effect, translated. So we had experts commenting on experts. The defence had their experts who were trying to undermine our case and suggest that maybe this was all naturally produced or that somebody else was responsible. But we had to simplify something so complicated so that anybody on the jury would understand that what we were dealing with, regardless of how complicated all it is, we've got one person harming other people.
The prosecution believed they had a smoking gun, the so-called confession letter penned by Victorino Chua himself.
The letter was brought up in court, but as part of Victorino Chua's defence, they said that this letter was written during a counselling session, which had happened a year before any of these incidents happened at the hospital. And obviously it was, as part of the counselling session, important that he got out all his feelings and his angers and his thoughts onto paper. But the prosecution argued that these were the thoughts of an angry man with unfinished business, who meant to do harm, who wanted to do harm, who hated the world, really, and everything that was happening to him. He wasn't in a good place. If anything, the prosecution said this built the profile of the man responsible for these crimes.
April 2015, and as the trial of Victorino Chua entered its third month, an apparent handwritten confession letter is presented by the prosecution. But despite the strength of the letter's content, giving the jury a clearer picture into the mind of the defendant, it still didn't directly tie Chua to the poisonings at Stepping Hill, which led to a spate of hypoglycemic attacks among patients, some with fatal consequences. Faced with a very real prospect of an acquittal, the prosecution revealed a substantial piece of evidence that they believed proved beyond doubt that Victorino Chua was the person responsible.
What we discovered during the course of the criminal trial was that Victorino Chua was the nurse who was looking after Grant on the ward over the course of that night when he became very unwell. We know from the testimony of one of his colleagues that he was almost certainly the sole person dealing with Grant. And we discovered that he had taken a blood sugar reading from Grant without any requirement to do so by the medical staff.
That sample that was taken was by pure chance kept and frozen. And this would have been completely unknown to Victorino Chua because as far as the staff were concerned, when they took a reading, they noted down what that reading was and that sample was destroyed. And that was normally the case, but what they did do just for medical purposes every so often, they'd pick a sample and keep it and freeze it. It just so happened that Grant Meisel's blood was frozen that night. That sample was sent off to an expert, and he actually managed to find this synthetic insulin in the saline solution, and he ruled that the only way that could have been in the blood was to have been put in there by somebody. Now, that was a hard-hitting piece of evidence that it went alongside the fact that when they looked at the records from that night, Victorino Chua was working that night.
On the 18th of May 2015, nearly 4 years after the first poisoning, the jury finally came to a decision.
Given what had happened with the earlier charging of Rebecca Layton, we were on tenterhooks. We obviously felt that we had presented the case, a very strong case, a very compelling case. So when the jury came back with a series of guilty verdicts, including murder, we were obviously extremely relieved.
I think when you've got a trial which involves a lot of really complex issues and a lot of medical jargon in particular, you do worry that the jury system won't work. So they'll be bamboozled by an able defence QC. I think the police were quietly confident, but it wasn't a nailed-on guilty verdict type case.
Victorino Chua was found guilty of 33 charges, including 2 counts of murder, and was jailed for life with a minimum term of 35 years.
He is a very dangerous individual, a very calculated individual. Thankfully, very, very rare. And that is why it's been good that he's been brought to justice.
We were extraordinarily relieved. I think a sense of relief and again a sense of the starting of closure behind this event, because this took the best part of 2011 and 2015. This is nearly 4 years where a huge cloud, was hanging on, not on the hospital, but on the staff. There wasn't a day where we didn't discuss the case or we had to do something related to the case.
Once Victorino Chua was found guilty, I think there was mixed emotions, really. Obviously, from the family's point of view, they had justice, but at the same time, many had lost family members and many had been through experiences that were unimaginable. But it wasn't just those that were directly affected. It was the hospital staff. It was the hours of investigative work that the police had to do.
We have those victims who received justice at the trial. What we don't know is how many other people he either harmed or attempted to harm. And there are people out there who may well have had doses of something, but they weren't fatal or they weren't anything that caused serious harm. So we will never know how many people Chua hurt.
It's very difficult to explain how a human being can get to that kind of level. Now, he's been described as a psychopath, and he must be a psychopath in order to do the things that he did.
He didn't care who he harmed. He didn't care who did the harming. He was more than happy for nurses and other doctors and other hospital staff to take the blame and to harm other people. He didn't care which patient got it. He was one of the most calculating criminals I've ever had to deal with.
I think Stepping Hill was obviously used as an example, really, in the aftermath of this case as to the standards that all hospitals should adhere to.
Stockport NHS Foundation Trust has a duty of care to its patients to ensure that they're looked after properly, and part of that duty of care is ensuring that the healthcare professionals that it employs are people who are able to undertake that job properly. Obviously, Victorino Chua was convicted of a criminal offence, but notwithstanding that, there were lots of issues about his registration, his training, and the extent to which he was looked into properly before being employed by the trust.
In response to the questions about Victorino Chua's qualifications, the Nursing and Midwifery Council issued the following statement in May 2015. We understand that Greater Manchester Police have concerns about Mr. Chua's qualifications, but we have not been shown evidence that his documents were fraudulent. When Mr. Chua joined the register in 2002, our registration process allowed applicants to provide photocopies of documentation. We recognise that this was far from ideal, and we have significantly strengthened our processes since then. We now require original documentation, and applicants must undergo a face-to-face interview and a 2-stage test of competence. In a statement following Chua's conviction, Anne Barnes, then Chief Executive of Stockport NHS Foundation Trust, which runs Stepping Hill Hospital, said, "Our storage of saline and management of prescription charts at the time of the incident was typical of those in other hospitals across the country. Whilst no hospital systems and processes can offer a complete guarantee against the actions of a determined criminal, additional measures are now in place which go beyond standard practice."
You trust people, and then all of a sudden you don't trust people because of the thing that's happened. You don't trust anybody then. I was one of the lucky ones, really, that they could have killed me, but they didn't. But I feel sorry for the ones that had died, It's not fair on their family, is it, really?